creating and managing reports. What do you think? Was that last nugget kind of mind-melting? If it wasn't, you really haven't spent much time yet with building queries. And in fact, if you haven't really spent time yet building queries, stop right now and go back and re-listen to that nugget and spend a whole day just building queries. Build up a query on how much RAM your machines have, and build up queries on some of the applications that your machines have. But just really, really get yourself familiar with the whole process of creating queries and collections, because, well, all of that flows into all of what we're going to do from here on out. In fact, this nugget's almost a gimme. Compared to some of the relatively long nuggets we've had so far, this one's going to be kind of short because, well, the whole process of dealing with reports is much simpler than dealing with queries. Really, the real meat of the job has been done whenever you understand what those queries are. Now, all right, we have to understand first that queries beget reports. You are a config manager admin, or at least one in training. And you've got this beautiful config manager solution that you can go into the interface and pull up all this data and view, the characteristics of the machines that you have. But at the same time, this interface, you're spending 20 nuggets really coming to grips with how to use this interface. So it might help to have a much simpler solution for your manager or the person in the asset inventory department or anybody else that really shouldn't have complete access to the whole console. And that's what reports are all about. Config Manager 2012 now integrates fully with SQL Server reporting services. Back in the previous version, there was a reporting services point, and then there used to be this thing we called a reporting point, which used a different version of SQL Server, or different service of SQL Server. Well, now in Config Manager 2012, we're fully SSRS integrated, and we're using Report Builder 2.0. So you'll see what this looks like. Installing the reporting services point onto your Config Manager server will enable some more features of IIS and actually make that IIS server ready to go for viewing via whatever browser your users have. In this nugget, we're going to talk about how you actually go about installing and managing a reporting services point. We're going to create and work with a few reports. We're going to manage some role assignments in SSRS. And then we're just going to kind of run some reports and create some subscriptions. Relatively simple stuff. Now, you might be wondering, okay, why would I want to have a separate reporting services point for my Config Manager installation? Right? Why would I need to separate out this reporting process from all the other processes that I think of? And the whole notion here is that reporting can sometimes be a bit of a tax on the systems that you have. If you have one system here whose job it is to be your Config Manager server, and maybe another system that's your SQL server, well, in a really big environment, it might be useful to have a third separate system that does nothing but reporting. By offloading the efforts onto this reporting server, well, you don't end up having to impact what you're doing here in your SQL server or here in your Config Manager server. So we haven't really talked about why all these roles get split up, but if you think about in your environment, what sorts of activities do you need to do? Well, in certain circumstances, splitting up these may actually be useful for you. I'm just going to, in this nugget, install all of this stuff onto the single server that we have here. This is, again, config mgr1. Taking a look back here in the queries node under monitoring. And let's see, we created that systems with Microsoft Word installed query earlier. And in fact, I've created another query here called systems with greater than or equal to 2 gigs of RAM. This is a great example of a type of query that has nothing to do with, or maybe very little to do with deploying software. And maybe you as the Config Manager admin, you might not care too much about which systems have greater than or equal to 2 gigs of RAM. But maybe the asset inventory person in your environment does. That person wants to make sure that everyone is at least at greater than or equal to 2 gigs of RAM. So you can create this query and then give that to them so you can find out well, which of my systems are actually at my minimum baseline for RAM? These three actually are. If I scroll over here a bit, you can actually get to the system resource name for what those systems are. But I don't want to give that asset person access to my config manager console. It just doesn't seem like a great idea. So what I want to do is instead give them access to a web report that they can then make use of. Now these web reports start over here in administration, because here under the server we actually have to add in that reporting services point. And the process to do that, relatively simple. Just like we did before, we want to connect up to whatever server we're going to install the point onto, identify the reporting services point here, choose the next button, identify the site database server name and the database name. If I click the verify button here, I can ensure that I've punched everything in correctly. Do I want to create a folder on the reporting services point, and what name do I want to give that folder? That will define what the path of that location will be. Which server instance do I want to use? And then down here at the bottom, which account do I want to use for actually enabling and working with that reporting services instance? Now, I have SMS client install in here as an account. That's the client push installation account. You would probably use a different account. This account, I'm just going to drop it in here just because it makes things simple for the installation. Okay, this account has, I believe, domain admin rights, but you just need the rights on the server, on the reporting services server, in order to create that reporting services point on that remote server. If I choose next, I can confirm the settings and close, and that reporting services point will get created on that server, okay, whether it be local or whether it be remote. Important to recognize here is that just like some of the other roles we've been talking about, if you create a different computer that is your reporting services point, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a config manager site server or a server that you've got licensed for config manager. If you have an existing reporting services point, you could very easily use that reporting services point and then just add in another folder associated with it. Now, if I take a look here, after a second or two, the background processes that actually create that reporting services point get created. And if I scroll down here, first of all, we see the count of roles is up to 9 now, and you can see that I've got this reporting services point that's been created. So now, with this reporting services point ready to go, I can begin creating reports. Those reports I'm going to find actually, they're not up here, they're in monitoring under reporting. You'll notice that when I add that reporting services point, well, a list of reports suddenly becomes available to me. This list wasn't available before because, well, I didn't have the point in my hierarchy. Now, there are a number of these reports that are out there. And if you recall, back when we were talking about asset intelligence, I mentioned to you that as we start building more pieces into Config Manager, we'll start to see more reasons why asset intelligence becomes handy. Some of these asset intelligence reports have already been added here. So computers in a collection, computers with a USB device, there's computers with licenses nearing expiration. So these reports are now available as a function of asset intelligence. And in fact, I believe if I go down to the asset intelligence node, you'll find that I actually have some inventoried software now. So again, these processes sometimes just take a period of time. There are a number of periods of the day that have to transpire, sometimes over a number of days, before you end up actually getting data sometimes. So and this is sort of a rule with Config Manager, complete aside, but if you do something and you're not getting the data, sometimes it's worth just waiting a little while. Eventually that data will get collected appropriately. So back here under monitoring, taking a look at the reports, let me first actually just view a report. All right, let's take a look at a report that maybe has some data that's useful to look at here. How about all software companies? If I right-click on that report, choose Run, well, it's going to run that report, and here inside of the console, I will get a view of the reporting services view of the report. So you can see here, here's all software companies. If I scroll down, there's all the companies that we've actually found across the different computers that are being collected in this Config Manager hierarchy. Pretty cool stuff. Well, this does us no good if we're trying to actually make this report available to people outside of the console. Right? This is all fine, but I still don't want to give that asset management person access to the Config Manager console. Thankfully, Reporting Services makes available reports through the web as well. So here I have Internet Explorer, and if I go to http config mgr1/reports, well, that will bring up SQL Server Reporting Services and allow a user that has access to this website to actually look at the different reports that are out there. Let's see, if I click on Config Manager, let's just take a look at the disk information here. Computers with count physical disk configurations. Right? I've got 2 physical disk configurations, 1 at that number of megabytes and 3 at that number of megabytes. So this gives me the ability to identify, well, okay, you asset management person can now view whatever reports you need to do your job. The neat part about these reports too is that here in this interface, they're multi-layered. You can actually drill down to see information, in this case, about the clients that have that specific hard disk size configuration. So here's client 1, and here's the interface type and the manufacturer and the media type. And if I drill down again, I can find, okay, here's the computer information for this computer, client 1, and that's about as far as I can go. So useful stuff here as it relates to these reports. Now, sometimes the default reports just aren't going to do it, just aren't going to cut it for your users. And you'll need to actually create your own reports in certain circumstances. You can create your own custom reports by right-clicking here on the Reports node and choosing Create Report. Now, if I do this here, you'll notice I get a little error message that appears. And because we have installed this Configuration Manager instance on top of SQL Server 2008 R2, we have a bit of a problem. SQL Server 2008 R2 actually uses Report Builder 3.0, but in this version of Config Manager with this hotfix level and update level, it's assuming that we're looking for Report Builder version 2.0. So if you try to create that report, well, you're going to end up with this little error message. Not to fear, though, that 3.0 version is actually already installed on this computer. All you need to do is actually a little registry hack to tell it to point to the right version of the Report Builder. If I go here to Run and bring up regedit, you'll notice in the location HKey local machine, software, WoW 6432 node, Microsoft, Config Manager 10, admin UI, and then reporting, we have this location here called Report Builder Application Manifest Name. And if I view the contents of that, you'll see that I'm using the 2.0, or I'm looking for the 2.0 version of this application. To point it to the correct version, boom. Voila! Now we are moving to the 3.0, or now we're pointing to the 3.0 version of this application. And in fact, if I go back here to Config Manager and attempt to run a report, you'll see that report viewer, or the report creator window appears. So this is the Create Report wizard. And I think I mentioned earlier that once you got the querying accomplished, creating the reports was the simple part. And that may have been slightly misleading, because even in this version of Configuration Manager, the ways in which you go about gathering data for reports is very different than the ways you go about gathering data for collections and queries. So remember how we were talking about this SMS provider, and the SMS provider provided this interface between Configuration Manager and its SQL database? And because of that, we're using that special SQL language, HUCL, to create those queries and collections. Well, when we create reports, we're using SSRS, and SSRS works directly with the SQL database. As a consequence, the types of reports that we create are actual traditional T-SQL statements and not this special WQL language. I can create model-based reports, although you'll find if you poke around the model-based reports, many of them are not probably the kinds of content that you're looking for. If I'm looking for WMI-based reports, well, a lot of that content I have to actually pull out by creating SQL commands. Now you see why we were talking about using SQL Server Management Studio and the view creator, because that view creator, if you recall, creates the regular kind of SQL that works perfectly for creating reports. So use that information when you're here actually creating the reports you're looking for. Let's create a memory report. So I just want to create a report that's associated with the memory on different computers. And honestly, this entire process is fairly complex, and there's a lot of art to it. And I'm just going to show you kind of what the screens look like, and I'll let you spend time really understanding how you would create your own reports. So let's put that in the hardware memory folder here and choose the next button to create that report. When the report gets created, you'll notice that it actually launches the SQL Server Report Builder 3.0 as a separate application. And this application looks, as you can see, very different than what we were looking at in the Configuration Manager console. This is a SQL application, and so we're dealing with the minds of the SQL developers here. And again, I don't want to get too deep into this because this is a fairly advanced topic that is kind of challenging to do here. But as you can see, what we have to do is click here in this report to add one or more pieces of data. If I wanted to, for example, to add in a new table or a matrix, I can do so by creating a data set here. That data set connects up here to my Config Manager NGT reporting services location. And if I choose next here, it's going to prompt me for the username and password I would use to actually create that connection. If you recall, this is the password we used earlier for installing SQL services, or SQL SSRS. If I choose OK, well, I now need to design the query I'm looking for. So DBO views and then VGS memory is what we're probably looking for here. If we're looking for memory information, there we go. And if I select that, well, I can pull out, let's see, here is, for example, the storage total value that I'm looking for. I can apply filters down here at the bottom if I want to limit it to specific amounts of memory, and perhaps if I'm looking for 2 gigs or more, I can define it by storage total equal to or greater than 2 gigs. Choose next, and it allows me to arrange the fields. I can just put that storage total field over here in the summary values. Next again, and choose a layout, a style for how I want the document to look, and finish to create adding that field into the report. So this whole process, very similar to how you would go about creating reports in, for example, Access. If you've been using Access before, or if you're a SQL knowledgeable person, well, you may have used this at some point in the past. But compared to previous versions of Configuration Manager, the whole process of creating these custom reports, far richer, but at the same time, a lot more effort involved in generating those reports. So the last topic we have here that we want to discuss in this nugget relates to assigning the security for different views or different reports that you would create here inside of SSRS. As you can imagine, if I make available this website, I may not necessarily want every user to have access to every report. Back to my asset manager person. That asset manager person may need to know how much memory is installed onto the machines, but they may not need to know the forefront antivirus settings. That may be outside of their scope. So the way in which we go about actually defining how these reports get the permissions and the roles that they need is done from a couple of different locations. Now, at the root of the website, you'll notice I'm here in Config Manager 1/reports, and then it's populated everything else, but this is considered to be the root of the website. I can click the folder settings link here and choose new role assignment to link an Active Directory user or group with one or more roles that are associated with this website. So for example, if I want someone to be able to publish and link reports into my reports, I can give them this permission here. Do I want to give them access to Report Builder? Are they just a regular user? These are the larger roles that you can assign to a particular user or group. But tailoring down to specific reports requires going back in here into the Configuration Manager console and defining the permissions in this location. So, for example, if this all software companies report is one that we don't want your standard report viewing person to be able to see, if I right-click on it and choose Properties, the security rights are actually defined here in this location. So I have to break the rights that are being inherited from the parent and then add in new additional rights here in this location. So there are a lot of different places where permissions get assigned here because of how we've set up this role-based access control. But with that, you can very granularly create different roles and assign those roles different reports here within your reporting services infrastructure. We have one last topic left, and that last topic relates to subscriptions. And subscriptions are actually pretty exciting in that you can define for one or more users or for a group of users the ability for them to receive reports on a regular scheduled basis. Now, right out of the box, and without any additional configuration, subscriptions allow us to deposit a copy of the report into a file share somewhere. If I want to actually send that report to a user, what I have to do first is actually make a connection to an Exchange server somewhere in my organization. You'll see back here under the administration node, I've skipped over this Exchange server connectors because this is a location where it begins to make sense. If I right-click and choose to add an Exchange server, I can actually connect up this config manager infrastructure to an Exchange server infrastructure for the purposes of sending out that report. And there are a number of different settings here. I'm not going to go through these mainly because I don't have an Exchange server infrastructure to show you. But recognize that you can use this as the secondary mechanism for delivering right into the inbox whatever reports you need to specific users. Back here under monitoring, though, to create a subscription, we need to take a look first at whatever report we actually want to deploy. So let me scroll here and find that memory report. The computers with a specific amount of memory. Maybe this is a report that asset management person would be interested in seeing. If I right-click here and choose Create Subscription, I can then deposit this report into that Windows file share somewhere. We'll call this memory, for example. And the path is just some server and share location. Now, there are a number of different formats in which the report can get created in. If I'm interested in XML files, maybe they're a developer, or maybe I have some other solution that is grabbing this data in a structured format, I can use XML. But for more human-readable formats, I have a number of different options here for how I would end up delivering that report. I've got to get them a username, and I've got to apply a password and confirm the password so that it can get correctly deployed onto that Windows share. I have some overwrite options here as well. When I create that, I can also define a delivery schedule for this report. You know, if I have other schedules existing, I can use a shared schedule if I like. Now, I don't have any right now, so there's none to see. But this will essentially drop that report down on an every 1 hour basis for a start and a stop time. If the report requires some parameter to define the report, well, then in the next screen, we can define what we want that report parameter to equal. You'll see, as before, I can choose the values option here to identify exactly what memory configuration I want to define. So these are the subscriptions that are available for you here inside of Configuration Manager. And again, if you have that Exchange connector set up, well, then you can email these reports out to different users in your organization. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about creating and managing reports. In some ways a simpler nugget than the last one, and in other ways maybe almost a little bit more complex. We talked about how the query data that you identify ultimately begets reports. And while the language that you use, the syntax is slightly different between queries and reports, ultimately the same process that you use for creating the queries is what you use for creating the reports. We talked about Config Manager's new full integration with SSRS and that whole new Report Builder 2.0. We also talked about how the 2.0 to 3.0 integration gets hacked with that registry modification. We installed a reporting services point, did some configuration with it. We created and worked with some reports, adjusted some of those SSRS role assignments, and then ran through a few reports and also created a subscription so that a user can get a regular report coming out of Configuration Manager. Coming up next, we're going to take everything we've learned thus far and begin to roll it into actually enacting change on the different computers we have in our organization. This is involved with the deploying of applications and the updates. These sorts of things that actually, or for many of us, why we purchased Config Manager in the first place. Deploying applications is very much a new process. There's a lot of new and very interesting ways in which Config Manager 2012 deploys applications. But before we get into that, we have to spend some time learning about how to package those applications for deployment first. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.